Okay, thanks for the warm welcome. We're really excited to be here with Peggy, Margaret-Anne. She goes by Peggy for short. Last year at this conference, I gave a talk introducing some of the research Peggy and I have been working on together in developer experience, and also sharing some of my views on the right and wrong ways of measuring productivity. Today, we really want to spotlight research. As we all know, developer productivity is such a complex topic, hotly debated, sometimes polarized, and that's why I think research is so important as part of the conversation. So today, we're going to dive into the origin of developer productivity research, some of your background and story, how you got into research, some of the research we've been working on together, and takeaways for practitioners. So to get started, Peggy, tell us how this whole developer productivity research thing got started.
Yeah, for sure. So good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to say that I'm very excited to be here today as well. I had a fabulous day yesterday, learned so many things, met a lot of cool people, and I'm very inspired actually going forward from what I learned yesterday. And some of what we're going to be talking about today is going to pick up on some of the points that were made yesterday. So, but you asked me, what is the history of developer productivity kind of research? And, it really does go back to the 1960s, where we had the first conference on software engineering, the NATO conference in 1968. And the term software engineering was coined by Margaret Hamilton. I'm not sure how many people here know who she is. She's shown here on a slide. And she led a team at MIT to develop the software for the NASA Apollo missions that put human on the moon. And here she is standing with the printouts of the source code from that amazing project. This picture kind of cracks me up a little bit because it isn't about the lines of code or about the height of the books, right, of the software that did this amazing thing. But it was really about the invisible work that went in by a whole team of engineers and people who believed in this vision and had the imagination and took that creative step to build that software with tools, by the way, that by today's standards are pretty impoverished, and then put human on the moon. So that was very inspiring to me. And that NATO conference that I talked about, I read it again the other day, the notes from that conference, and they talked a lot then of some of the topics that we're talking about here today, about how to improve developer productivity, which languages to use, which tools, which processes, and how to measure developer productivity. So that goes all the way back to 1968. And of course, it's been active topic since then.
So I was working at GitHub a few years ago, and we were having these hotly contested debates about how to measure productivity. And that's actually when I stumbled upon a bunch of papers by someone named Margaret-Anne Storey.
Yeah.
I was like, who is this Margaret-Anne Storey? What is all this research? This has a lot of the answers. So I'm curious, Peggy, how did you personally get into developer productivity research?
Yeah, so, well, it's a long story, but I'll give an abbreviation, an abbreviated version of it. So I guess my whole career, I have been trying to improve developer productivity. A lot of my focus has been on tools, developing tools. And actually, my PhD work started applying techniques from information visualization to the challenge of what's called architecture recovery. So you have this large legacy software system. People don't understand how it works anymore. Maybe they inherited it, or maybe they started working in a new company, and they had to understand how this legacy system worked. And so my PhD work was about creating these visualizations of the architecture so that developers could make change to the system. And, I was a programmer for, a few years before I did my PhD. So I thought I knew what other developers wanted. So I was pretty confident that my tool was, like the best thing, right, ever. And so as part of my PhD work and part of the validation, I decided that I would watch some developers using my tool. And actually, I compared my tool to other tools that they were using to see how it worked. Well, that was a bit of a wake-up call. I did graduate, so that's good. But what I learned was that a lot of the assumptions that I had held were wrong. First of all, that not all developers were like me. That was sort of the first thing. The second thing was that my tool didn't answer the questions that they actually had. And in fact, it told them things they already knew, and it didn't really give them the answers that they were looking for. And the third thing that really surprised me from that was that developers are incredibly capable and very creative, and they were able to do incredible things with really simple Unix type tools to get the answers that they needed, right, from the code. So because of that, I switched a little bit of my focus from developing and creating tools to doing more empirical work. So more work observing developers, listening to them, trying to understand what are their problems and what are their needs, and from that, come up with ideas for tools.
I think that's such a relatable story for folks here, because most of us here build tools for developers. And as we all know, understanding how these tools are actually used and how to make them better is such a big challenge, same challenge you ran into. So I want to ask you, you got into engineering tools and understanding how developers were using them. And how did you shift into specifically focusing on productivity and developer experience?
Sure. Let me tell you about that. So part of my journey too, during my PhD, I realized that studying developers in a lab wasn't, really representative of what was going on in industry. So early on, I formed some collaborations with companies, and in particular IBM for many years. With some of you here may remember the Eclipse tools and all of that stuff. And then also working with Microsoft, improving code review and build tools. And then I had a sabbatical in 2017, and the One Engineering Systems group at Microsoft, so they are the group that is responsible for trying to standardize the tools across Microsoft. They invited me to spend some time as a sabbatical there. And I thought, this is great. I'll get more insights on how developers are really working and how they're using their tools. So I jumped at that opportunity and I went there. And as soon as I arrived, I learned that there is this big focus on not just improving tools, but measuring the impact of using those tools. So measuring productivity. And so I thought, okay, that's something that I could take on as part of my research, is to really dig in and understand what are the factors that influence developers' productivity, as well as we became interested in what factors influence their satisfaction at their work. So I started off at Microsoft, having lunch with a bunch of developers every day and just listening to what they were complaining about and hearing their pain points, and also hearing their ideas of things that could be better. And then from that, did interviews and then formed this big survey. I'll do this pretty short here, but the survey basically led to this theory that shows all of these different factors that influence developer productivity and developer satisfaction. And a couple of key takeaways from that is that it's not just about engineering tools, but it is, also other factors such as their manager and such as their team culture and other factors that come into play. And another key takeaway from that research was that developers that are satisfied also feel more productive, and developers who are more productive feel more satisfied. So there's this relationship between those two. And so that led to that work.
So this got you focusing in on developer productivity, collaborating with Microsoft.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few years later, and you were one of the co-authors of SPACE, along with Nicole and Brian, who's here today. And everyone here knows what the SPACE framework is.
Yeah.
But I think the backstory is so interesting. I still ask you about it all the time. So share with the audience, tell the backstory of how SPACE came to be.
Yeah, I mean, SPACE really came about because of the pandemic. So overnight, over 40,000 developers at Microsoft had to switch to working at home, just like everywhere else across the world. And of course, what was on everybody's mind? Brian mentioned this yesterday. What's the impact of this going to be, this work from home, on developer productivity? And so we set about trying to understand what is that impact. And one of the first things that we did was look at pull requests. And lo and behold, we saw that pull requests had actually gone up. And so that, made us think, maybe things are not so bad. Leaders were pretty happy. Productivity maybe has gone up, not down, with everybody working from home. But of course, those of us that had studied developers and observed them had realized that that activity is just the visible part of the work that developers do. And it doesn't represent all of the other stuff. And how was that impacting that invisible work, which could maybe be a lagging metric, in terms of what they did in the future, as well as on their well-being and on their satisfaction. And so we did this big survey, and we indeed found that one of the big challenges was collaboration was one of the challenges, that developers work together, and that activity, wasn't really showing that collaboration, and that social isolation was going down. And so that led to a bunch of us realizing that a lot of companies in industry were kind of focused on this activity. And a minute ago, you saw a quote by Cal Newport on the slides. I don't know if anybody's read his book on slow productivity. Anybody read that? It's a pretty good book, right? And he talks about pseudo productivity, that notion that visible work is really productivity, and we know that it's not, right? I always tell my students this, right? Like when they're working on their projects, just because you're pushing code doesn't mean you're doing a lot of work, right? And so with SPACE, we wanted to really kind of get that message out there that if you're going to be trying to understand what's going on with productivity in a time like work from home, you need to think about these other dimensions. Satisfaction, of course, was one that my earlier research had shown that developers being satisfied is really important for being productive. But other dimensions such as performance, the quality of the work, how well people collaborate, which we know is completely essential for good work, and their flow, their experiences of how efficient they can be and whether they can deliver work efficiently and get feelings of flow when they're working together.
So I want to ask you, it's now been a few years since SPACE was published. You've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different companies and people who are trying to use it, who have used it. What are some of your latest thoughts on SPACE today?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, my initial reaction was that I was surprised at how much attention SPACE got. You asked me actually on the Uber coming here, how long did it take for you to come up with this framework? And, it really didn't take a lot of time. Brian's nodding. We were part of the same group because we had been studying productivity for so long and done so much research and read a lot of other research that we knew kind of what the main dimensions of productivity were. And we also knew that how productivity was being defined was kind of all over the place and not well done. And so from that perspective, coming up with these dimensions was relatively easy. And then the industry really went, yes, productivity isn't just about pull requests or lines of code. It's about all these other things. And these are the things that we need to worry about. In terms of how I feel, how it's being used, we did in the paper have suggestions that, I remember the matrix with different metrics you could choose. And we were trying to nudge folks to not just use one metric, but to use multiple metrics. But it wasn't really about choosing metrics. That was our main message behind SPACE. Really, our main message behind SPACE was slow down. Think about what productivity means. Think about what questions you have and use the dimensions in SPACE to help frame those questions, and then maybe dig into your data to help answer those questions. And also the dimensions in SPACE are very much, it's not that you can necessarily lift all of them at the same time. Like sometimes you have to recognize that there will be a trade-off. So if you're going to favor collaboration and get faster feedback to other people on your team or spend time onboarding somebody else, that might impact your flow, your experiences of flow if you're being interrupted by, say, a new member of the team. And that's okay if you think about what it is that you're trying to achieve and trying to get that balance.
So a couple of years after SPACE, you, myself, Dr. Michaela Grayler started working on research on developer experience. And this was such an eye-opening experience for me. You just mentioned the work that goes into coming up with conceptual frameworks and models. And it was really eye-opening how much went into creating this developer experience model. What insights do you want to share in terms of your views on this research?
Yeah, so In contrast to the SPACE framework, this was a lot of work. Don't try this at home sort of thing, is what I would say. It really took a lot of effort. We interviewed a lot of developers, and then we spent a lot of time going through those transcripts and pulling out this conceptual model of what it means for developer experience. And our research was building on this notion of developer experience is how developers think about, feel about, and value their work. These sort of three aspects. And so we asked questions in the interviews that probed on these things. And then we were able to pull out a lot of factors. These are factors that you've used in the DX tool. But more importantly, we pulled out that there are these contextual characteristics that influence which of these factors is going to have the biggest impact on a developer's experience. So if a developer is new versus a seasoned developer, if they're under pressure, maybe in a company, a startup is going to have, different factors that are going to matter compared to, say, Microsoft, and that looking at these contextual characteristics will influence those factors. And we also identified barriers to improving their experience. A lot of, I have a link to the paper there. I recommend reading it if you're interested in this topic. But we identified barriers such as developers said, I'm experiencing this pain point in my work, this friction, and I have no way of making this visible to my team or to my manager. So that was one of the barriers. They were feeling that pain, but they couldn't demonstrate and show evidence to people around them that this was something that was causing them an issue. And we also identified strategies as well as coping mechanisms. One of the coping mechanisms was, look for another job, right? If their experience is not good. So that's not what you want, right? As an engineering team, that your engineers are doing that.
I remember the coping mechanism, look for a new job or just check out and work on side projects.
Yes.
That's another coping mechanism, which was so funny.
Yeah.
So fast forwarding to more recently, myself, our CTO at DX, Laura, with collaboration with you, Nicole, and so many other folks, we've been working on yet another framework for measuring productivity called the DX Core 4.
Yeah.
And this is online at dxcore4.com. There's a white paper. But we created this framework for really two reasons. One was people kept coming to us and asking, hey, all you folks, You've done the Dora thing, the space thing, DevEx. So how do we put all these things together? How do we combine it and get started? And the other reason we put this together is we work with a lot of developer productivity leaders where one of their biggest challenges how to actually frame developer experience and productivity in a way that is marketable, aligns the organization, and is able to get funding for the investments that folks want to make. And so a lot of focus here on appealing to not just engineering leaders, but CFOs and CEOs. I know we have had a lot of discussions about the DX Core 4 and some differing views. So what are your thoughts on the DX Core 4?
Yeah, I think, as you said, this came up a lot yesterday as well. This need to convince leaders that it's worth putting money, right, into caring about developer productivity and experience. And what they really need is data, right? A lot of folks come from more of a scientific background where they need this concrete evidence, right? That the things that we're doing actually have the impact, right? That they're making developers more efficient and that they're making the company more money. So I think having these concrete metrics is something that's needed. And I know that you put a lot of thought into these 4 different kind of dimensions, which mirror a lot the SPACE dimensions. Effectiveness, as I've said, for me is really capturing that developer experience, developer thriving notion. The speed metric is just something everybody wants, to see what's happening. And then quality, of course, is key. And then impact is something that's often hidden, I think, from developers. They don't really know what impact their work has on performance of the company. And that is something that I think, having these 4 metrics will help bring that down to the level of developers as well.
And in creating the DX Core 4, we wanted something standardized and prescriptive, something that can be benchmarked, something that people can just get started with. But you in particular have words of caution around prescriptive frameworks like DX Core 4 and even some of the things you saw with SPACE. So can you share, how do you think something like this should or shouldn't be used?
Yeah, I think the there's two cautions I have. The first is just using them out of the box, without thinking about what are your goals, what are the questions, what are the contextual characteristics, like what matters in our organization. That's going to be very different in a startup compared with a larger company, right? Quality may not be important in a startup, for example, right? Because you're trying to get something out the door and collect data and know our customer is going to buy my product. But more, IBM or Microsoft or, the space shuttle, quality is going to be key. So asking those questions before applying them. But if you don't know at all where to start, at least it gives some companies a place to start. The second thing that I worry about is perhaps complacency over time. So you have an organization and they choose your 4 top key metrics, you call them, and then they just use those. And that's just not a good way to go. We know that high-performing teams continuously try to improve, and our high-performing teams also continuously try to improve the data that we're using. I see Max in the room. He talks about this a lot. He's always looking at how to change what metrics are being used and how that data is being used to improve productivity and experience.
Well, we have a few more minutes. One place I want to wrap up with is you're always working on so much interesting research outside of work with DX and Microsoft. So what's some research you're currently working on with your students that you think is worth sharing with folks in the industry?
Yeah, I'll share a couple of things. The folks that put their hand up when they said that they'd read Slow Productivity, after I read it, I'm like, I am doing too many things. I have to slow down and not work on as many things. And I love that notion of overhead tax. I'll maybe bring that up again later. If we work on too many things, we're juggling too much. But I'll share a couple of the things that I'm working on right now. The first one is with my PhD student, Artie Starr. She's looking at the theory of flow. So how developers get into flow and what breaks flow. And she's done some interviews to understand how developers get this period of momentum, how they ramp up in momentum as they're getting into that flow experience, and then what stops, what interrupts those flow experience. So she's looking at how developers troubleshoot when they need to troubleshoot. And she's also looking at metrics in the code, so she can identify when developers are working, which parts of the code facilitate flow, and then which parts of the code are always causing developers to stop what they're doing and go ask other people what's going on. So you can check her work out. I think it's pretty cool. The second piece of work that I want to talk about is with my PhD, Alessandra. I think she's here somewhere in the room today. So there's her picture. So Alessandra is doing some pretty cool research that I think could be of interest to many of you here. So you hear a lot about which metrics to use for measuring developer productivity and experience, but not as much attention is placed on how to present those metrics, how they should be visualized, how we should allow the stakeholders, managers, leaders, as well as the developers themselves to query that data, how we could use AI to help bring more insights from that underlying data, and how we can facilitate discussion with others about those metrics to maybe say, you know what, that's wrong, or you know what, this team over here did that, here's what you could try, and somehow bringing those aspects of the actions that we take and tying those in with the metrics and having discussions is missing. So Alessandra is working on that. So I hope some of you will get a chance to talk to her. She's also got another question that I think is really interesting, which is, well, and maybe some of you know the answer, and if you do, please share with myself or her over the rest of today, is how do the developers themselves really feel about this data that's being used, right, by their leaders and by their managers? Do they appreciate it? Do they think it represents what they're doing? Or are they worried about it? Or do they wish there was other data? So that's another question she has. So reach out to her.
So to close, you work with Microsoft, DX, and you, over the past day, got to hear what folks from tons of other companies are doing. What advice or closing thoughts do you have for folks here in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate that space is just, this set of dimensions that you have to balance, right? So anytime you make any change, we have to take into consideration what are the other aspects that we should care about. Another piece of advice that I have is if you're in a team and terms like productivity or quality are being used or experience, ask people what they mean by that. what do they really mean by productivity? What is it to you? You know, what does quality mean? I personally prefer the term software excellence than software quality, right? Because that represents a little bit more than bugs and so on. But other people, when they use the word quality, that's what they mean. So words matter, and how we think about them matter, especially when we're making claims about that. The other takeaway that, and again, maybe some of you here have other opinions or stories to share with me about that, is that it feels that often these metrics that are being used in very much kind of a top-down way, and there isn't enough attention to how developers are using them. So paying more attention to how the work that we're doing really improves developers and what they think about that. And thinking about developers and thinking back to that picture that I started with of Margaret Hamilton and the code. How are our metrics helping developers do that kind of work, be that creative? Do we have metrics that measure how much time they have to think and to be creative, to do that good quality work? And do our metrics give us insights on, are we giving our developers enough time to work with other people in a deep work kind of mode so that they can do that great work and produce software that is, you know, incredible and amazing?
Well, for folks who want to learn more, there's some links up on the slide right now for some of the research we've talked about today. Peggy, thanks so much for being here with me, and thank you everyone for attending today.